From Action News Jax, this is a breaking news report.
I'm Tanika Hughes, live from the federal courthouse in downtown Jacksonville, where we are just getting word that there has been a verdict reached in the federal fraud trial of former Congresswoman Corrine Brown. Our Jenna Bourne is in the courtroom, and she has just tweeted that the jury has reached verdicts on all 22 counts, and that verdict will be read at 2 p.m. Now, Jenna reports that when they made that announcement that a verdict had been reached, there were audible gasps in the courtroom. Now, this follows a question from the jury about testimony from her name is Marva Johnson, and her testimony was related to counts 8, 16, and 17, aiding and abetting in mail and wire fraud. The jury was basically asking for transcripts of her testimony, and the judge said that that's not typically allowed. He encouraged the jury to continue to deliberate while he made a decision on whether that would be allowed. And so when we got the word that Corrine Brown and her attorneys were going back into the courtroom just moments ago, we thought it was possibly because the judge had made a decision on whether or not those transcripts would be released. But we are now hearing that there is a verdict in this case. Just to take you back, we know that there was the trial obviously lasted 8 days. There were several amounts of testimony. We had heard from more than 44 witnesses between the defense and the prosecution, including Corrine Brown herself, who took the stand and maintained her innocence on all of these counts. We also heard from her alleged co-conspirator, Carla Wiley, and her former chief of staff, Ronnie Simmons, who both took plea deals in exchange for their testimony against the Congresswoman. So again, we are expecting a verdict to come down in the next 15 minutes. Our Jenna Bourne is in the courtroom. They're not allowed, once they're inside of the courtroom, to be on their phone. So when they get those breaks, they're able to step out and feed us information. In the meantime, make sure that you go to actionnewsjax.com, download our mobile app, sign up for our breaking news alerts so that we can let you know as soon as we know what that verdict is. But again, if you are just joining us, we're live here at the federal courthouse, where we have just been told that a verdict is in the federal fraud trial for former Congresswoman Corrine Brown. Jenna Bourne saying that the jury has reached a verdict on all 22 counts. And we do have our Action News Jax law and safety expert here on the scene. We're getting him set up because we want him to jump into this conversation. A lot of anxiety out here over the last few days. As you know, jury deliberations started on Monday. They went through Tuesday. And then yesterday, a very eventful day where one of the jurors was replaced with an alternate after making comments about higher beings and talking about Congresswoman Corrine Brown. After that jury shakeup, we had 2 questions from the jury, one about her taxes, another about the aiding and abetting with the mail fraud charge. And then today, another question, again, about some testimony from the case. But again, a verdict has been reached for the federal fraud trial for Congresswoman Corrine Brown. Right now, I'm going to send it back to the studio with John and Letitia.
All right, Tanika, great job out there. We're going to check back with you very shortly as we continue this coverage. Now, we're going to be on air until we hear the verdict. Again, we're expecting the verdict to be read at 2 o'clock today at the federal courthouse, downtown Jacksonville. Our Jenna Bourne is inside the courtroom right now. We're going to wait to hear from her, and we'll bring that to you. Now, we want to get you all caught up because, as Tanika mentioned, this thing has been going on. The trial has been going on for weeks now. We had 8 days of testimony. We've had the jury has now been deliberating since late on Monday. So this is day 4 of jury deliberations. As she's mentioned, there has been a lot that's happened since just Monday.
Yeah, there have been 3 jury questions since deliberations began, and the latest Tanika just broke down for us was about the testimony of Marva Johnson. They wanted the transcript from her. She was actually the regional VP of Charter Communications Florida, an education chair. They wanted to read her testimony, likely may have had a question about that.
If you're just joining us, the basics here are this. Former Congresswoman Corrine Brown has been accused in a federal fraud case here of basically using the One Door for Education charity that she was a part of as prosecutors call it, a personal slush fund, using thousands of dollars raised by this charity and put into her private bank accounts. That's what the prosecutors have alleged in all this. There are 22 counts, basically aiding and abetting mail fraud. We have wire fraud. There's tax evasion charges in all of this having to do with the income and what she claimed and didn't claim on her taxes. But basically, it all boils down to moving money from that charity into her own accounts. We have Dale Carson, our law and safety expert there at the courthouse. He's been following every move of this trial. He is our expert on all things trials. He's an attorney, a former FBI agent, so he has a lot of great perspective on what's happening right now with this process. Again, the verdict has been reached by the jury in the Corrine Brown federal fraud trial. We're expecting to hear that verdict at 2 o'clock. Let's bring Dale in now if we can to weigh in. Dale, this thing has been going on for quite some time, and really, I think a lot of us are kind of surprised that this has suddenly reached a conclusion now.
And Dale, John is basically saying, he's asking, you know, a lot of people might be surprised that they have reached a conclusion at this point because, again, we went through so much, I guess, turmoil, it seemed, in those first couple of days of deliberation, and then the juror switch, and then all the questions. 22 counts, the verdict is in. Is that surprising to you?
Well, this has been an unusual case, and particularly the difficulties with the jury panel. But, of course, we don't know, because it's secret, of course, what goes on in the jury room. So it's anybody's best guess, at least at this point, what the outcome is and how they arrived at it. And it'll be interesting to see, though, whether or not they have convicted the former Congresswoman or found her not guilty, or they have hung on certain counts, meaning they have not reached a verdict on certain counts, reached a verdict on others. But clearly this oddity with the jury pool, the difficulties they've experienced, leads right down the road to a possible appeal for the defendant here, former Congresswoman Corrine Brown, if in fact they find her guilty of any of the counts.
And let's talk about some of the highlights from this case, because the crux of it was she is accused of using money from a so-called bogus charity as a personal slush fund. And so the question really comes into play is how much did she know, and what was her involvement? And we heard from co-conspirator Carla Wiley, alleged co-conspirator, and we also heard from her former chief of staff Ronnie Simmons, who the defense says was the mastermind behind all of this.
And that's right. He had his fingers in all of the different accounts. He had the keys to the accounts, he had the cards, he had the checks, and he was in a position to make all of this happen. And of course, one of the tip-offs for the former Congresswoman would be if there was no money. But there was never a point in her account where their money was missing, so it really didn't alert her. And that's the argument that really the defense attorney made about this case. And they do have to demonstrate that she knew, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she knew or absolutely should have known that this was going on. And that's the key to the government winning this case.
The government also had experts with the FBI, special agents who did a deep dive of her finances, talked about the extra money she was getting in outside of her congressional salary and pension. And they also talked about One Door for Education, this charity, how all the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they brought in, but that only $10,000 went to scholarships as well. So they went through that deep dive of the finances.
Well, that's exactly right. The most critical piece of evidence, of course, is the former Congresswoman actually putting cash in ATM machines. I mean, that's the most direct evidence of transfer of money, and that's consistent with what happens in money laundering. When you money launder, you try to hide the money, you try to hide its origin and its ultimate location. So all of those things are indicators of some kind of fraud. Now, the difficulty is in proving that she knew that she was using funds that were not Ronnie Simmons, her chief of staff, and were actually funds from One Door, which was arguably a charity.
And, you know, she's also accused of filing false tax returns. On the stand, they interviewed her tax preparer, and obviously, again, Brown took the stand herself, and she talked about the bookkeeping and how she really didn't pay much attention, that she was so busy working for her constituents, and she delegated a lot of that to, you know, her congressional finances. Right. She delegated a lot of that to Ronnie Simmons, and she did admit, I was busy. I didn't go over my taxes in a lot of the cases.
Right, and that's a fair argument from her perspective. I'm busy. I didn't handle it, somebody else handled it. And one of the questions from the jury was, if she didn't know about it, can she actually be convicted of it? So we don't know what that outcome is yet, but it's clear that that was the defense posture throughout, that Ronnie Simmons was the mastermind. He engaged in this without her knowledge, and she was simply being taken advantage of.
All right, and Dale, we're going to take a moment to walk you back in time to show you how this whole thing started some 16 months ago. It all started on January 4th, 2016. Then Representative Corrine Brown was served a federal subpoena while at a Jacksonville restaurant. At the time, Brown was already in federal court battling plans to redraw her congressional district. In mid-February, an Action News Jax investigation reveals that subpoena was connected to a federal investigation looking at Brown's connection to One Door for Education, a charity in Virginia. Then in March, court documents show that Carla Wiley, the president of that charity, pleaded guilty to a federal charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Wiley also agreed to work with the prosecution. Later that month, the U.S. House Committee on Ethics voted to form a subcommittee to investigate possible ethics violations involving then Representative Brown. In July, Brown and her then chief of staff, Ronnie Simmons, were indicted in federal court on a total of 24 counts on 6 different charges. And in late August, Corrine Brown lost her bid for re-election in the Democratic primary against Al Lawson. In February of 2017, Ronnie Simmons flips on Corrine, pleading guilty to 2 counts. 1 count of conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud and 1 count of theft of government funds. Simmons also agreed to work with prosecutors and said he would testify against Brown. Then in April, the jury selection and trial began. So in that package in my timeline, we go back through the beginning when she was first given that subpoena in January of 2016. And we also show how Ronnie Simmons, in the midst of this, flipped and agreed to testify against her. And I want to talk about his testimony because the defense put it all on him. They said he took advantage of the women that he was close to, that she had total trust in him. And they also said that he just wasn't trustworthy and pointed out that Simmons' testimony and Carla Wiley, the president of One Door for Education, that they agreed to testify as a part of their plea deals. How do you think that factored into what the jury had to consider as far as the credibility of their testimony?
Right, and that's always an effect that happens when you have co-conspirators that decide they're going to testify against someone else. There's always an issue as to their credibility. Of course, they are doing it to get the benefit of a reduced sentence. And the way the government works is it reduces the points. When you accept responsibility, you testify against somebody else. All of those factors lead to a reduction in your potential sentence. So, of course, it's important that they testify favorably for the government and in a way that the government has anticipated. So in this particular case, and defense brought this up, can you really trust what a guy's doing who's done all of these things and he listed them out? And so I think it's fair to believe that there's certainly a motivation on the behalf of the co-conspirators to testify against the Congresswoman. And the Congresswoman ultimately is there only to testify for herself, which she did, and she seemed to do so pretty effectively. She doesn't have to testify. The government is required to make this case against her beyond a reasonable doubt without any of her testimony. So the jurors have the benefit of being able to watch what she's doing, hear how she's playing it out, and determine whether or not the Congresswoman's telling the truth or whether or not Ronnie Simmons and Wiley are telling the truth.
All right, Dale, we're going to toss it back to John and Letitia in the studio.
All right, thank you very much, Tanika and Dale. Jenna Bourne in the courtroom right now just tweeted that Corrine Brown is in the courtroom. We expect the verdict to be read here momentarily. Now, while we wait for this verdict, let me just tell everybody at home. Now, a lot of folks who live in Jacksonville know why we're doing this. Corrine Brown is an institution in Jacksonville. The former Congresswoman served in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1993. She lost her bid for re-election last August in the primary to Al Lawson, of course. But she has been an institution in Jacksonville politics. She was born in Jacksonville. She graduated from FAMU, taught at several Florida colleges, served in the Florida State House since 1984 before going to Congress. So she has been here and been a powerful person in politics locally for a long time. For anybody who may be new to this area, she was a ranking member of the House Committee on the Veterans Affairs, a member of Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which was key because she's gotten a lot of money to this area for those kinds of projects. As a matter of fact, she helped get funding to redo the federal building that she's in right now. So a lot of impact from Corrine Brown here in Jacksonville.
And to add to that, a lot of people felt like she was reachable. Her supporters in Jacksonville felt like they could call her office and say, Corrine, this is happening in my neighborhood. She seemed accessible to her supporters. Our Action News Jax Paige Kelton is live in the newsroom breaking down the big moment during testimony. Paige.
That's right. Tanika and Dale, we're talking about testimony. Over the course of those 8 days, we heard from 40 government witnesses, only 4 for the defense. Prosecutors brought out donors to talk about how much much they gave and why, Corrine Brown's tax preparer, her staffers, and the FBI agent who followed the money. Now, ultimately, the first testimony to really link Corrine Brown to One Door for Education came from her staffer and a longtime friend, Vaughn Alexander. Alexander testified that Chief of Staff Ronnie Simmons forged his girlfriend and One Door President Carla Wiley's signature on checks, and that the former Congresswoman would direct her to make those checks out to her consulting company, the Alexander Group. She says Brown would tell her to cash the checks, then deposit it directly into her account. Alexander testified she thought the tens of thousands in transactions were reimbursements. She told the jury, "I was not in a position to tell her no." All right, Ronnie Simmons taking the stand. He testified that Brown would tell him to withdraw cash from One Door and then deposit it into her account. Simmons testified he would also hand her cash in person that he withdrew when they were alone in the congressional office because he didn't want anyone to see. Simmons also said Brown would direct him on how to fill out One Door checks, and he would also hand Brown blank checks that he forged Wiley's signature on. Corrine Brown on the stand was as dramatic as we expected. She testified, "Any cash that Ronnie ever gave me, I always felt, and he told me, it was his personal cash." The former Congresswoman also got very emotional talking about one of the donors who contributed to One Door. She said, "I would not want him to think that he donated any money for me and didn't go to what it was intended." All of them, every last one. The real drama, though, came last Friday during cross-examination. Corrine Brown sobbed, pounded her fist on the witness stand, and asked the judge for a break. As the jury filed out of the courtroom, she yelled out, "He's trying to destroy my life." Now, something we heard repeatedly during this trial, the phrase, "You don't tell Corrine no." While the defense painted Brown as a victim and an old lady who didn't pay attention to her finances, prosecutors allege she knew exactly what she was doing when she profited off the donations of Jacksonville's rich and powerful. Now, was this testimony enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? John, Letitia, we are about to find out any moment now.
Indeed we are. Again, former Congresswoman Corrine Brown in the courtroom, the federal courtroom right now in downtown Jacksonville, awaiting to hear the verdict from the jury. Our Jenna Bourne is in that courtroom right now. She says that Corrine Brown came in, she was smiling and talking to her attorney there as she awaits the jury's verdict. Now, I want to let you know how this is all going to work out. Jenna is in the courtroom. She's not able to tweet or communicate with us while in the courtroom. Those are the judge's orders. So what she's going to do is, as the jury reads verdicts, we've got other team members there as well. So the verdict will come, and as it comes, Jenna and others will get word to us. So the verdicts will trickle in for us here, and we'll bring it to you as it unfolds. So stay right here as we await the verdict on 22 counts in this federal fraud trial for former Congresswoman Corrine Brown.
Let's talk a little bit about the jury makeup. They are the ones making this decision today. We have a full screen you can see here of who is sitting on this jury. Of course, we don't have names. We're not showing you who they are. But you can see it's made up of black male, white male, black female. It's all listed out for you. We know that there was a replaced juror. That happened just yesterday. An alternate had to sit in, and the deliberations had to start all over again. So those jury members welcomed a new juror into the fold, and they had to come up with a decision together.
For what it's worth, that Hispanic man replaced a white man in the jury makeup. So that is where we sit right now. Those are the 12 members of the jury who are about to tell us what they have decided on these 22 counts. Now, we have Tanika Hughes, who's been anchoring our coverage down there this week with our law and safety expert, Dale Carson. Guys, let us know what you think on all this as we await this verdict any moment.
Yeah, John, and right now I just want to run down those counts again. One count of conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. There were 7 counts of aiding and abetting mail fraud, 9 counts of aiding and abetting wire fraud, scheme to conceal material facts, corrupt endeavor to obstruct and impede due to the administration of Internal Revenue Law, and then 3 counts of filing false tax returns. And Dale, walk us through during deliberations what these jurors had to decide on each count, because in order for her to be found guilty on all of them or any of them, they had to make a unanimous decision.
That's exactly right. Every juror has to agree that she's guilty on certain counts and not guilty on others, or if they can't come to a decision, then they are deadlocked on that count, which we could have any number of counts. It's interesting to note here that both the mail fraud and wire fraud stem from the same circumstances, because you're having both communications over the telecommunication network and also by the U.S. mail or FedEx. to determine whether or not she's guilty of those charges. If she's guilty of one set, she's probably been found guilty of the other. But again, they have to find it unanimously. Each of jurors got to decide on their own independently that she's guilty, that all the elements of the crime are met. In other words, the government's presented sufficient evidence and it's authentic and truthful enough that there is no reasonable doubt that she's guilty.
And we know yesterday one of the questions that they were asking was about the aiding and abetting mail fraud, and for each instruction in each law rather, they have certain provisions, and they basically were asking the judge if she had to be found, if they had to prove all the different individual provisions.
That's right, and they all have to be proved, each element beyond a reasonable doubt, and they can use that as a basis for determining whether or not she was aiding and abetting. Now, aiding and abetting is a pretty broad charge, so it's going to be more difficult, I should think, to prove that charge beyond a reasonable doubt. Certainly, the IRS charge is something the Congresswoman herself spoke to. She said, I'm probably guilty of that, not in exactly those words, but that's the more likely charge that's been found here. As to the others, it's entirely up to the credibility of the two witnesses we talked about, whether or not they could be believed. They are the government's witnesses. They are being benefited by the government in a reduction in potential criminal exposure, jail time. And so they have a desire to please the government, and that was used against them by the defense attorney in saying, look, you can't trust what they're saying.
Corrine has had a lot of support out here from the start of this trial, from the beginning when the charges were first announced, and a lot of people have been telling us how much she's done for this community. Let's take a look back at some of her work and her influence in Washington. Corrine Brown was born in Jacksonville in 1946. She attended both FAMU and the University of Florida, where she graduated with a master's degree. She taught at several Florida colleges following that, and then the political life in the 80s. After losing her first election, she joined the Florida House of Representatives in 1984. She would stay there until 1993 when Brown made the leap to Congress. During her 24 years in the House, she was a ranking member of the House Committee on Veterans, a member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. She fought for Northeast and Central Florida, pushing for federal transportation funding. She secured money to rebuild Jacksonville's federal courthouse, the Orlando International Airport, and the Fuller Warren Bridge replacement. She also worked tirelessly to improve the lives of veterans. The apparent end of her political career began in the battle to redraw the map of her district. She unsuccessfully fought to protect it, but it was a major factor in her primary loss to Al Lawson in August of 2016. And we know on all 22 counts, Dale, if she is found guilty, she faces 357 years and a $5 million fine. But that potential sentence, if she is convicted, would change depending on which count she was convicted of.
Well, that's exactly right. And look, there's a sentencing that's sometime after the return of the verdict by the jury pool, and so the jury panel rather, and so we've got plenty of time. In addition to which, typically she'll be free until the actual sentencing date, and if they file an appeal, then she may be able to obtain what's known as a supersedious bond, a second bond, which allows her to remain out of custody until the ruling by the appellate courts.
And so it's likely, as you said, we were expecting that verdict to come down at 2 o'clock. It is 2:06 right now. These jurors, they started deliberating Monday and Tuesday. Then Wednesday, they had a juror switch out, and they had to restart deliberations. But for a total of, 23 hours, I believe my producer said, that this case has been in a form of deliberation for a total of 23 hours. Let's talk about that jury shakeup and how that likely could have impacted the verdict we have now.
Right. Well, of course, you're introducing someone new into the panel and into the group. He may have it was a guy, so he may have a very specific view about this, either toward guilt or innocence. We don't know that yet. And of course, when the panel comes back before the bench, typically they will get polled, which means that each individual juror has to answer the question, was that your decision? And if they affirm, yes, it was my decision, then the judge will probably convict her. He could wait to convict her until later, but typically that would happen now.
Let's talk about Brown's demeanor during all of this. In the very beginning, when this started happening, she was still a congresswoman, still a representative in the U.S. House. And right now you're getting a view from Sky Action News Jax, which is over the federal courthouse. But initially she was, from the beginning, she's maintained her innocence or not talked about the case other than saying that it was politically motivated because, as you recall, she was in federal court fighting the redistricting of her District 5,
right,
which she ultimately lost in the primary in August to Al Lawson. During this, again, she's maintained her innocence, and we've seen her coming in and out of the courtroom, her demeanor fairly calm. Yesterday, she even kind of lightly touched Lorena Inkland on her cheek when she asked her about the supporters she has in this community. And, you know, John and Letitia were talking about this earlier. This is a woman who's been working in some capacity representing constituents since the 80s.
Right. She's a well-known personality here, and she's benefited her community in a way that no one else could for many decades. So, of course, she has a lot of local support. But we've got to remember that the jurors come from as far away as Orlando that are in this trial. So they may or may not be directly affected by anything the Congresswoman has done for the community. And you really kind of want that in a jury panel. You don't want someone who's predisposed to any particular outcome. You want them to listen to the evidence, look at the evidence, watch the testimony, and determine whether or not, based on those facts, she's guilty of the crimes as charged.
All right, Dale, and just to reset, if you're just joining us, a verdict has been reached in the federal fraud trial for former Congresswoman Corrine Brown. We were told that verdict would come down at around 2 o'clock. It's 2:09 right now. We do know that Corrine Brown is in the courtroom at last check. Jenna Bourne said that she was smiling and talking to her attorneys. The reporters are not allowed to be on their phones in the courtroom, so as soon as those verdicts are reached and Jenna has a moment to step out, she's going to be tweeting and emailing us, and we're going to pass that information on to you. We have a team of reporters here at the courthouse, and Sky Action News Jax is also over us here downtown in Jacksonville. For now, I'm going to send it back to the studio to John and Letitia.
All right, Tanika, thank you very much. Now, you know, during this whole trial, the judge ordered a gag, so he didn't want anybody involved in this trial to be speaking with us. And of course, every day we had to ask what everybody thought, and we didn't get much of a response. What's interesting, though, is that Larry Spruill sat down with Corrine Brown right before this trial began. We want to show you what she had to say at that point in time.
Did you have any knowledge of...
Well, you know, I can't talk about the case.
Brown is accused of using a bogus education charity as a personal slush fund. Her former chief of staff, Ronnie Simmons, has already pleaded guilty for his role in the alleged scheme. We asked Brown about her previous claims that the FBI threatened elderly people in her district while investigating the case.
Why do you believe that?
Well, we're going to take our theories and factual information to court.
As for court itself, Brown seems confident.
And we do have a side to present, and we are ready.
If Brown is found guilty, she could go away for life. But if she's acquitted, she could walk free. So we asked if she'd consider another run in the political arena.
You know what? When you have your head in the lion's mouth, you ease it out. I am only thinking about what I'm going through. And afterwards, I will look at what are my options.
All right, that was Corrine Brown in her own words, speaking to her own Larry Spruill right before this trial began. You know, a lot of her supporters just simply don't believe the charges. They have supported her since the very beginning. Our Lorena Inkland is with some of those supporters. She's been talking to them throughout the trial. The conversations among them is just they don't feel like she's capable of all these 22 different counts. They think that she's almost being a scapegoat, that the charges were thrown on her and the blame should be elsewhere. Lorena Inkland is live in downtown Jacksonville. Lorena, what are her supporters saying now that there is a verdict?
Letitia, and some of Corrine Brown's supporters have started to arrive here at the courthouse throughout these past couple of weeks. She has been surrounded by a large number of supporters, so definitely we expect to see more people show up. But one of the first people to get here is Denise Hunt, and I'll bring her in now. Denise, thank you so much for talking with me. First of all, tell me what went through your mind when you heard there was a verdict.
Well, relief, because this has been a long 16 months. Absolutely, just... I guess nerve-wracking, just waiting, the anticipation.
I remember you were here when she was first indicted as well, so you've been a longtime supporter of Corrine Brown. Tell me why.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a longtime supporter of Corrine Brown. I'm a supporter of equal justice and fairness, and so that's what I've been down here supporting and making sure and trying to be just an advocate for that. what I've been thinking is that, you know, it's been a long trial. I feel like justice, that she was able to get a fair trial here in Jacksonville. And I'm glad that this is now coming to an end.
What are you mentioned that it was nerve-wracking. Tell me what's nerve-wracking?
Well, just going up and down, you know, with the jurors at the end, not knowing, you know, it was just very nerve-wracking. The cameras, you know, just everything about this trial has been nerve-wracking, not just for me, but for many people in this city.
If you get a chance to talk to her today, what would you like to tell her?
That we love her, that we appreciate the work that she's done for this city, that we're all imperfect, you know, and God's grace is real.
What would you like the community to know about Corrine?
That she's a hardworking, decent, bluntly honest person, that she's human, and she really loved Jacksonville. I can honestly say this woman loves this city. And I hope that today, no matter what goes on, you know, whether she's found innocent or guilty or whatever, that Jacksonville will remember that she really do love and care about the people in this city.
Thank you, Denise, for your time. I really appreciate it. We'll continue to stay out here speaking with supporters of Corrine Brown, and even those who may not agree with her. If they do show up here today, we'll be sure to speak with them as well. For now, we'll toss it back over to Tanika and Dale.
All right, Lorena. And Dale, again, the Congresswoman is accused of taking or using money from this so-called bogus charity for her own personal benefit. The prosecutors painted this picture of her abusing her power to benefit herself. During the testimony, the prosecution asked donors would they have donated had Corrine Brown not been the public face of this charity. What were they trying to get at there?
Well, they were trying to suggest that she was the impetus toward the contributions that these folks made. And of course, we all know with Congress, one of the ways you get access to a congressperson is you fund projects that they have an interest in. So that's not all that unusual, and I don't think that the government made a lot of points when it suggested that somehow she orchestrated those contributions, because she did not. What happened was there was someone else running this one door, and ultimately the funds were given to that program. She was not on the board. She didn't know where the money was going, her own testimony, and as a result, she couldn't forecast when the money would come or when it would not come. So in that sense, the argument was made by the defense that she couldn't have been in a controlling position to know where the money was coming from and when it would get there. So that's their argument. Now, many people would argue with the government and say the government's correct. She should have known. She was the leader, and if she failed to know, it's her own fault, and she needs to suffer for that.
Let's also talk about the impact of the surveillance images. They had maybe 24, I think, images of Corrine Brown going to the ATM and depositing money or getting money from the ATM. Right. How critical was that?
Well, she made a number of what I felt were convincing arguments about why she needed cash to buy backpacks in the garment district. I mean, she had an explanation. And whether I believe it or not is not relevant. Whether the jury believed it or not, that is relevant. So she had rationale for why those things happened, and they weren't just unusual. On the other hand, the government pointed out rather convincingly that doing those kinds of things, putting cash in ATMs from various locations after being transferred from Ronnie Simmons' accounts, you know, that's unusual. And that is indicia of money laundering, which is consistent with, of course, fraud.
So obviously we have a case here. The government brought these charges against the Congresswoman, the former Congresswoman. The burden of proof was on the prosecution.
Always.
So as far as the defense, she didn't even have to get on the stand, but she did. And you sat in for that testimony where at times got very emotional. What were your takeaways from seeing her on the stand? Right.
And of course, you know, one of the odd things about court trials is emotion's not supposed to play an issue. But clearly she did that in full view of the jury panel, and to the extent that emotion does play a role in our lives, it clearly had an effect on the panel. Now, it could have been a negative effect if they believed it was false, but if they believed it was authentic, then it can have an effect on arranging for an acquittal for her.
And right now, again, we're about 20 minutes almost into the wait for a verdict. We know that a verdict is in on all 22 counts in this federal fraud trial for former Congresswoman Corrine Brown. Our Jenna Bourne is upstairs in the courtroom. I'm constantly refreshing my Twitter. If you see me looking down, I'm waiting to see if and when she'll put out information about these verdicts. They're not allowed to be on their phones in the courtroom, so when the verdicts are reached, she'll step out and let us know what's going on. But Dale, 8 days of testimony. We heard from 44 witnesses.
Right.
At the last minute, the defense slashed their witness list down to 4.
They did.
Including Corrine Brown. Talk a little bit about the potential strategy for them deciding to kind of cut down on the
Well,
witnesses.
there are 2 strategies. One is the jury is now ready to hear the former Congressman's testimony based on what has already been testified to by the prosecution in the court.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of strategy in when you put your witness on and how many witnesses to put on, because after a point, the juror's tired and they don't really want to hear anymore. They've got the general idea, and now it's important to put on your prime witnesses to support your position and how it really went down. And this related to her trust of Ronnie Simmons.
Yes.
And I think her presentation and during the time that she testified was authentic, and I think it did point to the possibility that Ronnie Simmons was actually the mastermind of all of this. Now, the government would disagree with that position. Their position is that she controlled it and told Ronnie Simmons what to do.
Yes.
So the jury, that's their purpose, is to sort out fiction from fact and to come back with a rational decision about guilt or innocence in this case.
You talked about Corrine Brown being on the stand and how she made from what you figured, a very convincing argument to her defense, because you think about people in power, people in her position. It's not uncommon for them to delegate certain responsibilities, even financial, to other people.
Well, that's right. And her defense attorney said it well. He said the most important currency in this country is trust.
Yes.
And if she trusted the wrong person, which can happen to any of us, perhaps that's what's caused her precipitous fall from being a congresswoman to where she is today, charged in the federal court that she helped fund.
And I want to recap, we're waiting for the verdict in the Corrine Brown federal fraud trial. Just to run down the counts: conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, aiding and abetting mail fraud, aiding and abetting wire fraud, a scheme to conceal material facts, corrupt endeavor to obstruct and impede the due administration of internal revenue law. We're getting verdicts in right now. Corrine Brown has been found guilty on the conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. Corrine Brown found guilty on conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. That verdict coming down, that was the first count. Again, if you're just joining us, Corrine Brown has just been found guilty of conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. This is one of the 22 counts she was facing. Dale, explain what this means.
It means that she, in league with others, decided to violate federal law. And that doesn't mean that every party knew what the other party was doing, but the operation of the conspiracy is one designed ultimately to commit mail and wire fraud. And that means talking on the phone, means sending monies through the mail. Those are the kinds of things that she has been convicted of in connection with this matter. And conspiracy is much easier to prove. You realize that some of the other counts require a direct personal involvement and hands-on, and that's more difficult to prove, but we have yet to hear about the other counts. And remember that the panel is going through each one of the 22 counts in open court, and they've got to attest to the fact that that is their actual verdict.
And Dale, I want to also point out, Carla Wiley, the president of that so-called bogus charity, One Door for Education, when she took her plea deal, she also pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud as well.
Yes, that's right. And that's just the beginning of the process. There are large conspiracies the government charges every day with literally hundreds of people involved in the same conspiracy, but they are all working in a criminal endeavor toward a goal or an ordinary outcome that they all profit from typically.
Yeah, if you're just joining us again, we are on verdict watch as the verdict begins to come in the federal fraud trial for former Congresswoman Corrine Brown. 22 counts in all, and so far she has been found guilty of count 1, conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. This is all going back to an alleged scheme to use money from a so-called bogus charity, One Door for Education, as a personal slush fund. And Dale, this whole case, it was really about, the prosecution said about greed and power.
Well, I mean, that's their argument. What they're saying essentially is that the foundation was set up. She should have known where the money was coming from when she got these advances of nearly $141,000 over the course of, I believe, 3 years. So she should have known. And the fact that she didn't directly participate in where the money went, how it was transferred, is irrelevant to the charge of conspiracy, because they were all working together for a common purpose. And that is, again, one of the easiest crimes for the government to prove.
And so counts 2 through 8, what we're standing by for now is aiding and abetting mail fraud. Explain exactly what that charge involves.
Well, it's similar to conspiracy, but you're more directly involved. You have to have some knowledge. You have to do certain things, send money. Typically, she was not, former Congresswoman Corrine Brown was not involved in the transfer of funds. And so that may protect her somewhat, but we'll have to see what the jury thinks.
Because you said that one is more difficult to prove than conspiracy.
Well, that's exactly right, because you have to have some direct involvement. You have to have basically hands-on, whereas conspiracy involves just the scheme to defraud, in this case, and the committing of mail and wire fraud.
And let's go back to the conspiracy count that she has been found guilty of so far. When we talk about the mastermind behind all this, her defense attorney argued that this was Ronnie Simmons, her former chief of staff, that he was the mastermind and that he and his girlfriend Carla Wiley conspired to come up with this plan.
Right.
But this shows that the jury was not completely convinced that that was the case, that she had some knowledge of what was going on.
Well, she was the recipient, a beneficiary of the conspiracy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that she was the lead person in charge of setting it up and operating it. It could well have been Ronnie Simmons. Nevertheless,
she had knowledge.
She had knowledge, and she's part of that conspiracy because she used those funds to her own benefit.
And when we talk about benefit, I know that was something where she was very adamant on the stand that she did not know where this money was coming from. They asked her, well, how did you not know when you had all this extra money in your account? And she said, you know, I have birthdays, there's Christmas, I have boyfriends sometimes.
Right.
She had reasons for where she says this extra $142,000 came from.
Well, that's right. She has an explanation, but apparently based on what we're hearing from the jury, that was not credible to the jury panel. And they believed that based on remember, it's not simply one count. There are 22 separate counts in connection with all of this. And so they felt like the massive amount of opportunity she had to understand where the money was coming from or how it was being delivered to her, they just didn't buy off on the fact that she could not and did not know.
And let's talk about the FBI. Those special agents, they assessed her transactions.
Sure.
They broke down the money that was coming in from this charity, the $800,000. They talked about $330,000 being spent on a lavish party, but only 2 scholarships being awarded to students.
Well, that's right. And that was what seemed to infuriate the government. If the money was going to a charity, the charity should be spending money for the people who are the beneficiaries of the charity. And according to the government, that was absolutely not happening here.
And as far as their case was, you know, Corrine Brown said she never meant to defraud, intended to defraud anyone.
And that's the big key. The showing of intent is a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, if there were memos from her personally to Ronnie Simmons saying, this is what I want you to do, the case would have been easy. But that was not the case here. There was nothing in memo form related to how the money should be managed or anything like that.
And Dale, we're getting new information. Found guilty on 18 of 22 counts so far. The former Congresswoman just being found guilty of 18 of the 22 counts so far. And again, these counts include conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, aiding and abetting mail and wire fraud, aiding and abetting mail fraud, scheme to conceal material facts, filing false tax returns, corrupt endeavor to obstruct and impede the due administration of internal revenue law. But again, we're still waiting for the actual breakdown, but so far found guilty, Dale, of 18 and 22 counts. I want to talk about the magnitude of this because a few days ago when I was out here, I had a woman who came up to me and said, there's no such thing as an honest politician, and she believes that politicians have a culture of being involved in maybe less than above the board dealings.
Right.
And some people felt like Corrine Brown was being made a scapegoat.
Well, and she herself said this is being done for racial reasons, that it's not, and political reasons is why this is being done, so that they can get me out of office and they can have their way with Congress. And, of course, that is her position, but clearly based on what the jurors have listened to and heard all the testimony directly, actually from the witnesses and from the evidence people, the FBI agents who broke down her finances, they've determined, based on that information, that there was sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she was aiding and abetting, which are the more difficult charges to prove.
Well, Dale, I have an update from Jenna Bourne, found guilty on 18 counts of the 22, not guilty on 4 counts. And the 4 counts that she was found not guilty on, count 3 of aiding and abetting mail fraud, and that was a FedEx of a $5K donor check to One Door. Also not guilty on count 5 of aiding and abetting mail fraud. Again, the one you said would be more challenging to prove. That was a FedEx check of $7,000 donor check to One Door. Also found not guilty on count 14. That was aiding and abetting wire fraud, not mail fraud, but wire fraud. And this was a Simmons email with FedEx label for a $7,000 check. And then also count 16, not guilty for aiding and abetting wire fraud. This was another email from Simmons seeking a $10,000 donation, and that was in September of 2015. So you called it from the beginning when we talked about which charges will be more difficult to prove, and you said that aiding and abetting, because again, that involves her actually being involved directly with pulling off some of these crimes.
Well, that's right. And of course, now the issue is whether or not she can deal with the outcome of this,
yes,
which of course are the criminal charges bring with them a time that she may have to spend in prison in order to satisfy the government that they've gotten the proper result here and will prevent other people from engaging in this same type of activity.
Let's talk about the sentence, though. She was facing, if found guilty on all 22 counts, we know that she's been found guilty of 18 of the 22. She was facing 357 years and a $5 million fine. This is a 70-year-old woman, so that would essentially be the rest of her life. What do you think the judge is going to do here?
You know, typically when there's going to be a pretrial investigation, a post-trial actually investigation, where they will examine her history personally, and then they'll make recommendations. And all of these counts, these are only an opportunity for the court to figure out what it might do. They are not a requirement. The court does not have to follow that sentencing guideline. It is merely a guideline, and candidly, she's never going to be forced to serve that much time.
Yeah.
She has no prior history. She's been a prominent member of the community for many decades. This is the first charge she's ever sustained that I'm aware of. Mm-hmm. And the result is that typically in white-collar fraud cases, you're looking at penalties somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 years.
What do you think? What kind of message is a verdict like this? Former Congresswoman, a Jacksonville staple, former Congresswoman Corrine Brown, a 70-year-old woman who's served the community since the 80s, Jacksonville born and raised. What kind of message do you think that this sends for her to be found guilty of 18 of these 22 counts in this fraud trial?
Well, it obviously sends the message that you shouldn't behave this way, although I doubt that this particular verdict is going to cause people to really think and process through, well, I shouldn't send this illegal check through the mail. But I do think it is an effort by the government, for one of their prime objectives is to make certain that the Congress men and women and the senators, men and women, and government in general is doing the right thing and are playing by the rules. And when they don't play by the rules, then they need to be punished. Now, there's been a lot of controversy in Washington recently about all of this. Some concerns about former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, whether she should have been prosecuted or not. But clearly here, former Congresswoman Corrine Brown, at least at this juncture, has been found guilty of these charges. Now, she will have the opportunity to appeal the verdict, and there are grounds. Certainly the replacement of one of the jurors is a clear ground for appealing the case. And of course, that may allow her to be out for a protracted period of time. In essence, years, while the appellate court reviews these cases and the points in appeal to determine whether or not she was correctly found guilty.
And I know that during the week, and it was just speculation, when we were trying to figure out what would happen here, you mentioned that if the government didn't nail this case, that you didn't really think that they would try this case again because of the circumstances, the same circumstances we're talking about now. That's right. Her age, her history. You were saying that if the government didn't nail this, they probably wouldn't bring a case like this back. Well,
that's right. I felt that if in case it was a hung jury, in other words, the jury couldn't reach a decision of guilt or innocence on some of the charges, that the government would just not bring it again. And some of those cases, of course, they determined that she was not guilty. I'm not aware of any of the counts for which there was basically a disagreement which wouldn't allow them to determine that she was innocent. It seems that all 22 counts have been addressed, effective by the panel. So the result is that the case was properly brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the federal government, and based on the testimony of witnesses and the evidence presented, she's been found guilty.
You sat in on that testimony. In your opinion, what was some of the turning point testimony for you? I know we heard from her staffer, Vaughn Alexander. We heard from Ronnie Simmons. We heard from Carla Wiley. What were some of those pivotal moments that you thought?
Well, I look at it obviously from a defense perspective, and when we have cooperating witnesses, there's always an issue of their honesty and integrity. Are they telling the truth, or are they benefiting themselves, as the defense argued they had done previously? So I always question cooperating witnesses or co-conspirators in this case. So if those people are lying, then the case is improperly brought. If they're telling the truth, then, as the juror apparently thinks that they were, then there should be a conviction.
At this point, I actually want to bring in Action News Jack's Jenna Bourne, who was in the courtroom during this entire trial. We know moments when we found out that the verdict had come down. You tweeted that you saw Corrine Brown smiling and waving. She's been very upbeat and very stoic during this whole thing. What was her demeanor like as those verdicts were being read?
Well, and right beforehand, she was smiling. She was talking to her attorney. But as those verdicts were being read, she became very stoic, very serious. That smile went away. No breakdowns, emotional breakdowns like we saw on the witness stand when she testified last week. But really, the courtroom was very quiet as the verdicts were read. We could hear one person crying softly. That person was not Corrine Brown.
Let's talk about some of the key moments for you. I asked Dale some of the key moments in this testimony, and we know that Corrine Brown gave a very emotional testimony. For you, being an observer in the courtroom, what were some of the key moments in the trial for you?
I think the biggest moment for me was when the defense decided that they were going to drop this long list of witnesses that they had originally said that they could call, and they were going to just knock it right down to 4. 3 of those people they knocked out in 45 minutes, and then they just brought Corrine Brown right up same day. That was a big surprise, I think, for everyone in that courtroom.
A lot of surprises this week when it came to the jury. Talk about some of the jury questions that came up and some of the specific things that they were asking the judge for information on.
Well, and after about 12 hours of silence, that new juror was brought in, the alternate, and that really seemed to shake things up, because within 30 minutes of that alternate being brought on, they had their first question after having no questions for about 2 days worth of deliberations. So they were asking for today specifically. They had one question, and that was about the witness testimony of a woman named Marva Johnson. She was a head person at Charter, but at the time it was Bright House Networks. Yes. They got swallowed up. But so she was in charge of how Bright House at the time spent their philanthropic money. And she decided to spend tens of thousands of dollars of that on One Door for Education because of Corrine Brown. Mm-hmm. So the jury asked for a transcript of her testimony. The judge was really on the fence about that and had actually just made a decision when we found out there was a verdict. We never even found out what that decision was.
Because the verdict came down.
Right. I mean, we were in the courtroom, presumably because the judge was about to tell us what his decision was on whether to supply that transcript or not. The attorneys were in there. Corrine Brown was in there. They were all in there together. And all of a sudden, there was a knock at the door. And that's when we found out they had reached a verdict.
Now, I asked you about your impressions of Corrine Brown and her demeanor. What were your takeaways of the jury? Their demeanor, your observations of the jury?
When the verdicts were being read, the jurors, most of them, very straight-faced, very stoic. I think they felt a lot of responsibility here. I did see one juror who was holding his head in his hands, but other than that, no real dramatics here. I think that they took this responsibility very seriously, and from what I understand right now, the judge himself is going down and individually thanking each juror for their lengthy service. I mean, we're talking about 3 weeks here.
Mm-hmm. And I want to take this back to Dale now. Dale, walk us through what the next steps are. We have the guilty verdict on 18 of 22 counts, found not guilty on 4 counts. What are the next steps in this process?
Well, what's going to happen now is she will get a report generated about her prior history non-criminal history about her service to the community. That will be used by the judge and in determining what sentence she is to endure. Now, of course, the prosecutor and the defense will weigh in on this as well, and they will have what is known as a sentencing hearing. That typically is going to be a month off while that report is prepared.
Jenna, I want to go back to you because I want to talk to you. Over the course of the last 16 months since she was served the subpoena, you've had several confrontations with the Congresswoman, tried to interview her and ask her questions about this case. And early on in this process, she said that she believed that this was all politically motivated.
She did. She did tone that down as we got closer to the actual trial, but that is a claim that she made over and over again. She made claims about race. She made claims about politics. Those never came up during testimony. That never came up during her testimony or anyone else's. These claims of racism and these claims of playing politics, of it being a, quote, witch hunt, just never came up in court.
And we also know that in August of 2016, during the primary, after she had already been indicted, she did lose that primary battle to Al Lawson. And Dale, and earlier we were talking about the fact that some might believe still, despite this verdict, that Corrine Brown essentially is a scapegoat here.
Well, right. Politically, that's her position. Obviously, that wasn't discussed in court at any length, but certainly it did weigh on the jurors because they're concerned about the community as well. Not only whether the facts prove that she's guilty, but also the effect that that decision will have.
And if you're just joining us, we are here live at the federal courthouse. I'm joined by my colleague Jenna Bourne and Action News Jack's law and safety expert Dale Carson, where former Congresswoman Corrine Brown has been found guilty on 18 of 22 counts in this federal fraud case. The guilty counts were for conspiracy to commit mail fraud, scheme to conceal material facts, a corrupt endeavor to obstruct and impede the due administration of Internal Revenue Law, filing false tax returns. The sticking points were on the aiding and abetting the mail and wire fraud, which Dale explained to us that those charges are a little harder to prove. Dale, explain why the conspiracy charge is a little easier potentially to prove than an aiding and abetting charge.
Well, conspiracy is just generic. It carries the same penalties as the actual count, but it's generic. The result is that it's easier to prove because it doesn't require a written document between co-conspirators. All it requires is actions, one act in fact, used to further the goal of the overall group. Here, that would be funneling money to the Congresswoman.
Jenna, I want to go back to you about some of the key testimony we saw from Carla Wiley, the president of the so-called One Door for Education, this bogus charity that was not registered to solicit money in the state of Virginia, and also Ronnie Simmons, who both took plea deals and a part of that agreed to testify against Corrine Brown. Talk to me about some of the key moments from their testimony.
Well, and before I get to that, one thing with regards to them, the judge was talking about sentencing for Corrine Brown today and decided not to set that sentencing hearing for now. It's probably not going to be for at least another 90 days. And part of that, they're saying that the judge is saying that potentially Carla Wiley and Ronnie Simmons will be sentenced before Corrine Brown is sentenced. Of course, they've not been able to be sentenced because part of their plea agreement was them following through on this. Correct. And they are able to, if the government feels that they have provided a special help to them in this case, then they can recommend to the judge that they be given a lighter sentence than they otherwise might have been. But going back to the important moments of the testimony, I think one of the biggest things that stood out to all of us in the courtroom when Carla Wiley and Ronnie Simmons were testifying is they both claimed that, well, first of all, they were in a relationship, and they both claimed that they didn't know the other one was stealing from One Door for Education. Both dating, both admit that they were stealing from this foundation that Carla Wiley had set up and founded in honor of her own mother, and both denied that they knew anything about the other one stealing more than $100,000 from that charity. I think that's the biggest thing that stood out to me.
And I know prosecutors, they also talked about that spending from One Door for Education, how it brought in $800,000, only gave out 2 scholarships, but they made it a point to run down the lavish parties and events hosted by or in honor of Corrine Brown. Walk us through some of the details from some of the lavish spending that we heard about during the trial.
Right. I mean, it's really was quite vivid for the jury, and they saw a lot of photos as evidence and exhibits of the $750 birthday cake. That was one that came up a lot. And basically what that broke down to was it was a reception for Corrine Brown, and there was a birthday cake served as part of the catering plan for her daughter Chantrell. Now, this birthday cake was being charged at a rate of $7.50 a person, and there were 100 people slated for it. So, hence the $750 birthday cake line that the prosecution kept saying over and over. And we also heard about the Queen Corrine beverage that was served at many of these events, which, if you're curious, was a strawberry Bellini with a sugar rim. And Corrine Brown said on the stand that she had no role in formulating that beverage. And so she tried to discredit a lot of the more lavish details that the prosecution was giving about these events and trying to distance herself from it, saying there's no record that I made decisions for that, even though several emails between her staff and from her daughter said things like, this is the band Corrine Brown wants, and showed her approving menus, things like that.
I want to talk to you both about Corrine Brown's testimony. Very emotional. She's never been someone that we would think of as a shy woman. She's always been very outspoken, very passionate, very animated, but she gave a very emotional testimony. And at one point, as the jury was filing out, slammed her hand down on the desk and said, he's trying to ruin my life. And Jenna, you were in the courtroom for that. Both of you were able to sit in on her testimony. And you said that it wasn't clear if she was referring to the prosecutor, Tyson Duva, or if she was referring to Ronnie Simmons.
That's correct. And really, it was an anomaly in the testimony that we had seen so far. None of the testimony had really gotten anywhere near that point of being emotional. Everything had been very even keel, and while these major revelations were coming out of the testimony, it was not being delivered in a dramatic way up until Corrine Brown took the stand. She has always been known for sort of her political theater, for being, if she's got an opinion, you're going to hear it, and has always garnered a lot of attention for that. And on the stand, she delivered. I mean, she, at one point, when she actually had to ask the judge, I need to take a break, and the judge asked the jury to file out, like you said, she was banging her fist on the witness stand. She was sobbing uncontrollably, and she yelled as the jurors were filing out of the room, he is trying to ruin my life. And still not clear who exactly she was talking about there.
And Dale, let's talk about the emotion. And you said usually emotion is not something that jurors are asked to consider, but it has an impact.
Well, it does have an impact, but of course the jurors are instructed to disregard that. They're there to see the facts, listen to the testimony, and make a determination on that basis of the law. What does the law say? What are the elements? Are they met? Are they not met? And that's to be the entirety of it. But clearly we're all human, so when that outburst happened and the jury heard it, it had to have an effect on them. But it could have had a negative effect if they didn't believe it was authentic. If they believed that it was theatrics, then that does hurt her case. And evidently, based on the outcome here, it didn't have an effect, at least at the level that it got her an acquittal.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, Jenna Bourne here, Action News Jack's law and safety expert Dale Carson joining us. Corrine Brown, former Congresswoman here, representing our area for decades, has been found guilty of 18 of 22 counts in her federal fraud trial. Jenna, I want to talk to you about sentencing because we're waiting for her sentencing, and also the sentencing for her alleged co-conspirators, or her co-conspirators at this point, Ronnie Simmons and Carla Wiley. Explain what the next steps are.
So the next steps here are likely that Ronnie Simmons and Carla Wiley will be sentenced first. They pleaded guilty in Carla Wiley's case, I believe, over a year ago, in Ronnie Simmons' case months ago. So they're going to come up first, and they were not able to be sentenced until now because a condition of their plea agreement was, of course, testifying in this trial. Now that's over with. Now there's a verdict. And so the government is really able to weigh and assess how helpful and crucial their testimony and cooperation was to getting the conviction that the government wanted, the 18 of the 22 convictions that the government wanted. So they're going to be sentenced first, and then at least 90 days out, the judge was saying just now in the courtroom, we will see sentencing for Corrine Brown. Now, originally, the numbers we were given was that she faces a maximum, I think it was 357-year prison sentence and nearly $5 million in fines. It's unclear because of the counts that were chosen exactly how those numbers are going to be affected. But needless to say, she could potentially be facing a lot of time.
I want to go through some of the pivotal moments in the testimony, and one event that I found interesting was also the testimony of her longtime staffer, Vaughn Alexander, because she essentially was the first person to tie Corrine Brown directly to having knowledge of how this whole thing was happening, directing where checks should go, where money should go. Talk to us a little bit about that testimony of Vaughn Alexander.
Vaughn Alexander's testimony, like you said, was very interesting because it really was, she was the first person to say, Corrine Brown directed me how to spend One Door for Education money. And it was seen by many as a huge betrayal to Corrine Brown, this person who was on her staff for so long and was so close to her as a congressional staffer in her office, making these statements and testifying against her. She has not been indicted. She is not under any plea agreement. So this was really, I think, had an impact on the jury. Now, Corrine Brown, during her testimony, came out with something new about Vaughn Alexander. She says, the reason that I have all these deposits from Vaughn Alexander in my account is because Vaughn Alexander owed me money. Vaughn Alexander was extremely in debt, and I gave her these loans.
Yes.
These deposits are just her paying me back. Whereas, of course, the government's point of view is that, or what Vaughn Alexander testified, is that Corrine Brown directed Vaughn Alexander to write One Door for Education checks to her company, and then write checks from her company to Corrine Brown, or to withdraw the funds from the Alexander agency and deposit that cash into Corrine Brown's account, essentially laundering it.
Dale, let's talk about the strategy of prosecutors with having those types of witnesses who could put Corrine Brown in the middle of this scheme.
Well, the first thing you want to do as a prosecutor is to let the jury know that this individual's getting benefit and what that benefit may be, so that they don't allow the defense attorney to come up and say, isn't it true that you're getting these benefits, and isn't it true that's why you're lying, and isn't it true none of those things happened? But what Jenna points out is very true. That stacking of money, that moving of money here and there is classic money laundering. Mm-hmm. Money laundering is typically mail and wire fraud, particularly when it's coming from a source that it's not supposed to be come from. Remember, she also failed to report that as income, so she underreported her income and overreported her contributions, so she reduced her tax liability. All of those factors work together to argue at her guilt.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the donor testimony. In one case, a donor gave $11,000. They thought it was going for to provide some transportation to an event, but it turned out that jet came to Jacksonville for a Jags versus Redskins game and for a luxury box at that game. But again, Jenna, that was just a part of one of the examples of lavish spending that prosecutors laid out.
And I think that was one of the most visual cues for this jury when it comes to these lavish parties. I mean, like I said before, they were showed photos of the parties, photos of the $750 birthday cake, and having the head of the Florida Democratic Party talking about his private jet and him paying $11,000 for Corrine Brown and the people in her inner circle to fly to this luxury skybox at a football game, and he testified that he thought that that flight was going to an event to raise money for One Door for Education, but the government says no funds were ever raised, and it sounds like the jury bought that.
We talked about some of the emotion in Corrine Brown's testimony, but let's talk about some of the moments where she was defensive when she was explaining her case. When we talked about, we're standing by also, we're waiting for Corrine Brown to come out of the courtroom, and we're keeping an eye on the moment that she does walk out. So we'll bring that to you when the moment that happens. But as far as her testimony goes, there was a moment when she was asked to explain. Her attorneys are walking out right now. Let's go to Lorena Inkland, who's over there at the door where this is all happening. Lorena.
Yes, the attorney for Corrine Brown is about to come out of the courtroom right now. Mr. James Smith, he just motioned and said 1 minute. You see him right there. He is coming out. I see Chantrell Brown and a few other family members. He's about to come out right now.
Way to her car first. She's not going to be saying anything, obviously, since the trial is still pending, sentencing and other matters. But if we could, let her go, and then I'll be talking to all of you. Please let her go. Please open up.
Please open up, please. Corrine, I know you're heartbroken. What do you want to say to your supporters?
Corrine, what's going through your mind right now?
All right.
Does anybody want to speak on her behalf?
Corrine, what are you thinking? You're coming through.
Corrine, do you think that was fair?
Yes, Corrine, disappointed with the outcome.
Man, y'all let her through, man.
Were they wrong?
Do you think the jury acted fairly, Corrine? Are you going to fight it?
Let her through, please.
You better fight it, Corrine.
What do you want to say to the children from One Door for Education?
Ma'am, let her through.
What do you want to say?
Let her through, ma'am.
Anything you want to say to your supporters? They're saying we love you.
Love you.
She didn't say a word, guys. She just walked right out, but her supporters around her were telling us to get out of the way and to let her through. As you can see, she is leaving right now with local faith leader Bishop McKissick Sr. Just closed the door there, and her daughter is also in the car with her. As you can see, she didn't say a word, but her facial expression really told the story here. You can definitely tell she's obviously disappointed in what happened. She wouldn't answer any questions whatsoever, but her supporters around her, I asked if she was going to fight it, and one of her supporters said she better. I don't know if you guys were able to hear that, but one of the supporters said she better fight it. So this is the scene right now. You can see a lot of her supporters still around here yelling, we love you, but she would not say anything back. They're still trying to get her out of downtown. Her attorney did say she wasn't going to make any comments. We're expected to see if he will talk to us here a little bit later and get his thoughts about what's going on, what's going through her mind, what's going through his mind. But right now what you're looking at is friends of Corrine Brown, supporters, local faith leaders. She's in this black car right now. She just got in there with her daughter and other friends, clearly, visibly upset. You could see it in her face as well. And as you look at a aerial view from our Sky Action News Jacks, you can see a lot of commotion here outside of the federal courthouse. There are people outside of Sweet Pete's right now taking pictures of the situation out here. There are a lot of people just looking and watching. This has been going on for weeks now. People are very interested, coming up to us constantly, wanting to know what's going on. And finally, it has come to an end, at least for now. I did, once again, just to recap, I did ask her if she was going to fight this, and she wouldn't answer, but one of her supporters definitely wants her to, said right next to me that she better fight this. We are going to head back up to see if we could talk to the attorney right now and see what he has to say. So we're walking back up to see what Mr. James Smith has to say.
This case for going forward to sentencing. She wants to let her supporters know that she is still strong and resolute. She still maintains her innocence, and she thanks everyone for their prayers and their support. What she asks is that the press please honor her privacy in the days and weeks coming up, and she wants to send out a special note of thanks in particular. And let me just say, the one thing that I will always remember about this trial is that each day there were a number of her friends who came and watched the entire trial, and who spent a lot of time loving her and supporting her. And that, to me, is an example of friendship and love. And I know the only reason that they did that was because they know who Corrine Brown is and the amazing person that she is. Now, I understand that you guys probably will have a lot of questions. You'll want to ask me what I think personally about the verdict or what I think led to it. And I hope that you understand that I'm obligated not to talk about those things because there are rules of court that I have to follow as a member of the bar. So I can't answer any of those specific questions. Let me just say that the next thing is you should look out for some motions that we will be filing for a new trial. I can't give you the reasons for those motions, but they will be coming soon, and that will continue to fight. I would just remind you finally of this. Governor McDonnell recently went through trials charges on corruption. And initially there was a rush to judgment to believe that his life was going to end, that he'd been convicted. And as you know, right now, he stands as a free man whose conviction was overturned. So the American legal system has a number of levels, and this is just the first step. So with that, I can't answer any...
Do you think this was unexpected?
With that, I can't answer any specific questions about the case.
Well, what do you think? Do you think it was unexpected?
Well, sir, I'm not going to characterize it in any way. All I can say is that you're correct on the numbers, but as far as it being decisive, I'll leave that up to you to characterize it.
Why do you think there needs to be a new trial?
After a new juror was added?
Well, again, with regard to there being a new trial, I will tell you, just like any client, what you do is you sit down, you evaluate the evidence, and then you try to take advantage of all the motions that are available. So I'm not going to lay out the basis for the motion for you now. I'm just telling you that likely we will be filing one.
When you talked to the Congresswoman afterwards, you talked about her demeanor, but did she hug you? What was her reaction? And, what was she telling you?
Well, I won't go into what she told me, but I can tell you that she's an incredibly strong woman. Never forget how this woman was able to get into politics. She fought and sued the state of Florida to be able to get into Congress. And she served in Congress as an African-American woman at a time where that was something that was unusual. You don't do all the things that she's done and accomplish all that she's accomplished without being incredibly strong. This isn't the first trial that she's had to deal with in her life, and it's not going to be the last one. And so I think if any of you are looking for news that she was crying or upset or anything like that, that's not the case at all. She's strong. She's fighting for her innocence. She fought for her innocence during this trial, and she intends to continue to do so afterwards.
Did you expect this outcome?
No, obviously. I didn't expect this outcome. I mean, that's why the Congresswoman pleaded not guilty and took her case to trial. So there was no expectation of this outcome whatsoever. But again, when you talk about outcome, let me just let you know this is the first phase of the process, and this isn't the end.
Do you have any concerns about the jury? I mean, were you happy with this jury?
I don't have anything to say about the jury at all. I don't have anything to say about the jury.
So no comment on a verdict coming a day after a new juror was added?
No comment on that. No, sir. No comment.
Has there been a change of venue?
No comment on that.
Do you still think it was a smart decision for her to testify?
No comment on that.
Would she do it again?
Your question was, what do I think she's going to do? What is she doing now? Well, she's going to head home. She's going to spend time with family. Obviously, it's been a very taxing time. And, after that, she'll get up tomorrow and she'll continue to fight.
And you? What are your plans?
Well, my plans, obviously, is to continue to work on this case. It's been obviously a long 3 weeks. So, I'll take some time, relax a little bit, look back at some lessons learned, and then push forward. This isn't the end of a process. For any trial, when the verdict comes, there's still one very important thing, and that's sentencing. About 90 days from now, if a motion for a new trial is not granted, she's going to appear in front of this judge, and he's going to have to make a decision concerning her sentence. That's incredibly important work.
What lessons have been learned from this?
What do you think?
All right, first question, what lessons have been learned? I think the most important lesson I've learned is never to talk about what lessons have been learned right after something. You always take some time, and I respect the question. I know it's a legitimate one, but I don't think there's been enough time for us to really pause and reflect and think about that.
Does your client believe that she got a fair trial?
Let me just say this. I'm going to let her answer that question, and now's not the appropriate time to answer that question.
Do you think, will she be speaking with us?
At some point, obviously. I mean, I think Congresswoman, she is always going to speak her mind, so just now is not the time. I mean, we're less than, an hour from when the verdicts were announced, so she needs some time to just let this sink in and think about it.
Were there any surprises for you in the testimony? Anybody that testified? Is there anything there that you weren't expecting?
No, not at all. I mean, as part of preparing for a case, you go through the discovery, you do investigation, so there weren't any things that came as surprises to us. And as far as your question in terms of filing the motion, the rules give us a certain amount of time, but we can also ask for extensions. So I'm not exactly sure when we're going to be filing it, but obviously I know all of you have Pacer accounts and you know how to log in, so you'll be aware of it when it comes out.
And in the end, it was only a matter of hours and only 4 witnesses. Why the change?
Well, obviously things change based upon what's presented by the prosecution, so I'll just leave it at that.
Would we see some of those witnesses in the sentencing, some of those Congress members, Farrah, Jesse Jackson?
I would expect so. I mean, she has a long record of service. She's done a lot of good things. I think it's important in light of a conviction, people start to focus in on the charges. And just remember, you don't sentence someone solely based on the charges. You sentence them based upon their life. And she's done a lot of good things. I think even her harshest critics would admit that she's done a lot of good things. So, yes, to answer your question specifically, you will probably see a number of people at sentencing that you didn't see at the trial.
You mentioned that there was a governor's case that was overturned, but regardless, I think there might have been some eroding of public trust there. Do you think that even if the convictions are overturned here, can you comment on what you think this will do to public trust in public officials?
Well, I think that's depends on how you define public. I mean, if you define the public as sort of a broad segment of people who believe that politicians are corrupt and let you down, I'm not going to comment on that, but just remember, too, there are a lot of people in the public who still believe she's innocent and are not going to take what happened here and then suddenly change their minds, about her. So there's a large segment of this community and nationally who they have a lot of faith in her, they still love her, and they believe her. So I don't think that's going to affect their belief in her reputation or what she's done.
Are you disappointed that the jury didn't buy your story of saying that Ronnie Simmons took advantage of her?
Well, let me say this. I've done this long enough to know that what a jury does sometimes has little, if anything, to do with a lawyer. I don't see it as my story. These are the facts that were presented, and you never know what led to a jury's conclusion. And so, let me just tell you, this is very early on in the process. I know it may seem like this is the end of the game, but this is just, frankly, the first quarter. I'm a big football fan, and I can tell you that this is the first quarter, and there's plenty of time left.
Can she afford it? At the beginning of this thing, we went through, we followed kind of a number of attorneys, and she even sort of finally admitted that, this that stuff is expensive. So how long are you in the game for, and can she afford it?
As far as whether or not she can afford it, that's really a private matter. I won't go into that, but I will just say that I'm in it as long as it takes to go all the way to the end. And so whatever the end may be that sentencing, be that an appeal, and I'm not thinking about money right now. I'm thinking about the fact that I have a client that I intend to zealously represent all the way through the process.
She was highly critical of the government before this trial, characterized this case as a witch hunt. Are you concerned that during sentencing that could come back and be a problem for her?
Well, I think what we have to do is probably be fair to her. This was an incredibly stressful process, and there are times when she said some things, and I'm not sure if she was critical of the government as much as she was maybe certain entities or individuals. But I guess what I would ask people to understand is this: there's really no process like this at all. It's incredibly tough if you're a private citizen, but just imagine being a public citizen and having to go through this. So if at times she said some things that perhaps she could take back in the past, I would hope that in the spirit of charity and forgiveness, people would look past those things and realize that those things were said during a stressful time.
Some of the people who testified against her, she mentioned, were her friends and longtime friends. I mean, could we see them speak on her behalf during sentencing? Is that something possible?
I think so. I think so. One of the things that was incredibly, I think, not surprising to me, but of note, is that a lot of the donors who were called on behalf of the government, when they left the stand, went over and hugged her, shook her hand, in fact, even kissed her on a couple of occasions. So people cannot and will not forget all the good that she's done. Let's remember, no one's life is a snapshot. Our lives are films, and you have to look at each and every frame. And Corrine Brown is not going to be defined by what happened here today in this courtroom. She still has plenty of days left on this earth. So I would ask that all of you in your reporting keep that in mind. You're writing about someone who's not just a defendant. You're writing about someone who is someone who's done a lot of good in this world.
Do you think she'll ever have amends with Ronnie Simmons?
Oh, I don't know, and I just have no idea. That's really too difficult a question to answer, to think about at this time.
She potentially faces 357 years. How do you think the sentencing will go?
Right, and that's been one of the more interesting things to watch here, 357 years. Let me just tell you, I usually don't say things aren't going to happen. That's not going to happen. If that were to happen, I would come back here and I would wear, what channel are you from, CBS 47, a CBS 47 hat, and say that I'm an idiot. That's not going to happen. There are federal sentencing guidelines. The important thing to know in this case is that there's no required sentence that involves prison. So, I've heard that figure often, and I know it puts a lot of angst into people when they hear about it. Let me just assure everyone, she's not going to be getting anything even remotely close to that.
We've been hearing like 5 years, possibly 7, and fines. Is that more realistic?
Right now, it's too early to say. Remember, the great thing about our system is that we leave that up to the discretion of the judge, and there's a lot of work to be done between now and the time that sentence is imposed.
We heard a lot about a lot of other entities and people. Do you know if there's any more court hearing or court proceedings or investigations that are happening, or is this matter closed to your knowledge?
I don't know about anything else, and as far as I know, this is it.
What's next for you?
What's next for me is I'm going to leave, and then a little bit later on, I'll be meeting with my client. And, listen, I practice law. I have a lot of cases, and, those people who practice criminal defense, my criminal defense brothers, they know that more often than not, this is the result in cases. Ours is a profession where you don't win all the time. In fact, you don't win most of the time. But I think that we've learned to define a win as going into court and giving people the impression that when the trial is over, the client had an attorney who cared and who advocated professionally and vigorously. And so, I'll be honest, I'm human, and there is an element of sadness and disappointment about the result, concern for my client. But there's an old phrase, and that is, tomorrow the sun is going to come up. It's going to come up for me, and it's going to come up for her. And I still have a lot of work to do in this case, and so I'm going to work hard, because we still have the motions, we still have sentencing, and so what's next for me was really the same thing that's next with any case. I'm going to get up tomorrow and keep working hard.
Quite simply, you've said, as we've met you over the last year, she's maintained her innocence, but certainly the jury didn't see it that way, and not even on the specific counts, but kind of on the overarching charges. And so is she maintaining that at this point, or has her comment to supporters evolved?
She maintains her innocence, and that hasn't changed. All right, the jury, please understand, our legal system depends upon evidence that's presented in court. And understand, juries, while I have a lot of respect for them and I have respect for the system, I think you and I have been around long enough to know that there have been many people who've been convicted months, years, if not decades later. Things have come out that have shown that they actually are in fact innocent. So this is part of a process. The correct way to understand the process, not to take you back to the first day of law school, but this is all about whether or not the state was able to prove its case, and that's why a jury returns a verdict of guilty or not guilty. We don't have innocent or not innocent on the line. So she maintains her innocence. She has always said and will continue to say that she's not guilty of these charges, and that's not going to change because of the result that happened here.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Appreciate it.
Have a good day.
So what we heard
We just heard from the attorney for Corrine Brown, and I will now toss it back to Tanika and Dale, who are standing by.
Stand by, Dale.
Goodbye.
And we heard a lengthy explanation from the attorneys for Corrine Brown, talking about they plan to file another motion, talking about she still maintains her innocence. Dale, something interesting that I thought that he mentioned was the case of the former Virginia governor, Bob McDonnell. He and his family were accused of taking $177,000 in gifts, including a Rolex. His attorney argued, it looks bad, but that's just kind of how politics works. He was found guilty of public corruption, sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, and that conviction was overturned. What do you think that says that he brought up this case? Because I know a lot of other politicians facing similar charges are now using that same case in their defense as well.
Well, certainly this is part of the strategy. If Corrine Brown had pleaded guilty to one of these counts, she would have eliminated her ability to appeal it later. And that's what this is all about. This is about the ability of the defense to appeal a conviction, in this case, of a number of different counts. And so this gives her the opportunity to work this straight up to the U.S. Supreme Court and argue that she should not have been convicted. If that were to happen and the sentence is vacated, we're back at square one. The government has lost its ability to prosecute again because there's no double jeopardy.
I want to talk to you, Jenna, about her demeanor. We heard Lorena Inkland, who's just a few feet behind us, talk about how Corrine looked visibly upset as she left this courtroom. But throughout this process, she seemed, on the outside at least, calm, measured, even having a joking moment rubbing Lorena Inkland's face just yesterday. And you were in the courtroom, and you also witnessed her demeanor, which was also pretty much the same until today.
Well, that's right, and there have been several instances throughout this process where she's been out in the hallway, joking with people, laughing, walking in, walking out, very stoic, seeming very confident, smiling, even having joking moments like you mentioned with reporters about this, saying, you know, I can't answer your questions, things like that. And this is really the first time that we've seen a crack in the shell for her this entire process. And I think it has been difficult for her as somebody who does like to speak her mind and does like to tell her side of the story, to be told by the judge throughout this process that she could not make statements to the media, and having to do those silent walks past our microphones, I think was a challenge for her during a very emotional time. But apart from that moment where we saw that emotional breakdown on the stand, where she was pounding on the witness stand, sobbing uncontrollably while talking about her former chief of staff, Ronnie Simmons, who pleaded guilty and testified against her, this is really the first time that we've seen her seem not confident about what's going to happen next.
And obviously, in the midst of this, she did lose her bid for re-election in the primary after serving 12 terms. You were there on election night when she lost. I want to talk to you about that, but first, I believe we have a statement from Representative Al Lawson, the man who actually won her seat. He made a statement on Twitter. Do we have that available? Okay, my thoughts and prayers are with Corrine Brown during this difficult time. We're grateful for her many years of service to Jacksonville. And Representative Lawson also told us that he was surprised it came quicker than they thought it would. But you were there on the night that she lost her primary re-election bid to Lawson, and you were in the room. Talk to us about that night.
Well, and she has had a rough year. You know, she lost her redistricting fight that she fought hard for. She lost that seat that she's held on to for 12 election cycles. And that night, while they were watching the election results coming in, she and her inner circle were in a back room. They were not out visible to the rest of us. While supporters outside ate and partied and danced, she was in the back. And as it became clear that this was not going to go her way, a lot of supporters started to leave. They didn't stick around for her to come out. And when she did finally come out, she seemed very strained. You could tell she was holding in a lot of emotions and trying to smile as we asked her questions. And eventually, in a show of confidence and positivity, danced. And I believe that we have video of her dancing the electric slide that night when I was there after losing to Al Lawson, which was a huge blow for her. And so I think that really just goes to show the kind of face that Corrine Brown tries to put on in the face of adversity, which she certainly has had a lot of losses in the past year.
And we have a statement also now from the FBI. They say that she exploited the needs of children and deceived her constituents. And Dale, I know that was one of the things she made clear. And that's always kind of been her reputation. That's the reputation she's built, that she works hard for her constituents. We had countless people coming up to us outside talking about, she's done so much for us. She's done so much for us. She helped to secure funding for Orlando's airport, for this very federal courthouse, which she was just convicted in, to help replace the Fuller Warren Bridge. She has a record of doing a lot, working for veterans issues. But the FBI says, she was a part of a deception that involved potentially giving opportunities, educational opportunities, to young people.
Right, and the Bureau, not the Bureau necessarily, but certainly the U.S. Attorney's Office and the prosecutors have argued that the real victims here were the children who didn't receive scholarships and computers. And they tried to make that appear as though that really is the purpose of this case. But the purpose of this case is different. The purpose of this case is to convince people in government and other places that you can't commit fraud, which means taking from one person in a way that they don't understand or know, which is exactly what happened here based on the jury's finding, and using it for something else.
Yeah.
And really, Congress people, no one should do that.
If you are just joining us, Action News Jack's law and safety expert reporter Jenna Bourne here outside of the federal courthouse in downtown Jacksonville, where former Congresswoman longtime representative of this area, Corrine Brown, found guilty on 18 of 22 counts in her federal fraud case, including conspiracy and filing false tax returns. She'll be sentenced in about 90 days. At least 90 days. We know that the co-conspirators, Ronnie Simmons and Carla Wiley, will be sentenced first. We know that they did testify against her as a part of their plea deals. Right now, I want to go over to Action News Jack's Lorena England, who's just a few steps behind us. She just got to question the defense attorney for Corrine Brown and also heard from some supporters.
I did, Tanika. That was a very lengthy press conference that you heard from the defense attorney for Corrine Brown. He says that it is not over, that this is merely just the first quarter, relaying it to a football game. He says that there will be motions coming through as well. And in terms of the sentencing, he says that it will be nowhere near, obviously, the 357 years that she's facing, that there will be obviously some leniency there, and that she won't get anything near that. However, a lot of people are disappointed with the outcome today. One of those people, I actually have several people here with me. One of them is Cece Littlejohn. She has been inside the courtroom every single day with Corrine Brown. I just got the chance to talk to her just now, and she is telling me that she's very disappointed. And Cece, if you can tell us again sort of how you came to know Corrine Brown.
I met Corrine Brown May 10th, 2012. At the sentencing of my god sister, Marissa Alexander. She actually stood up to enter the courtroom because she gave my sister the minimum of 20 years in prison.
How are you feeling today?
I'm disappointed because all through the whole 16 months, Congresswoman Brown been going through this. I thought it was bogus, and for the jury to come back with 18 guilty verdicts, it's unbelievable because I know she didn't do what they said she did.
Do you think she got a fair trial?
No.
Why?
I feel like because the prosecutor, when Congresswoman was on the stand, it's like the prosecutor, whatever his name, it's like I felt like he was bullying her and attacking her and like asking her the same questions in different ways, and she was trying to answer those questions. But then he cut her off, and the judge had to step in and ask him to allow her to talk and to explain herself.
Thank you so much, Cece. I'm going to bring in Denise now. Denise, what did you think about the outcome here today?
Well, obviously I was disappointed and hurt. But mostly, what I was really, just blown away was when they allowed her to come out the front door. And, when you consider the contributions that Corrine Brown made to this city in terms of building this very courthouse that she was prosecuted in to the tune of $100 million, and she actually named this courthouse, I think she should have been afforded the dignity of coming out the back door. And that's what I was really hurt about.
Would you like to see her speak publicly?
I think that she doesn't need to speak publicly. I think she's spoken enough, and I think at this point we need to just let the lawyers do what he does best, and that is defend. And I think he's done a remarkable job, considering it was just one against what appeared to me like David versus Goliath in that courtroom.
Thank you, Denise and Cece, for sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate you guys speaking with us. We'll toss it now back to Tanika, Dale, and Jenna.
All right, Lorena, thank you. And again, we saw supporters out here all week long, and even people from the community who were coming up to me asking, is a verdict in yet? Everybody kind of wanted to know what was happening inside of that courtroom. And that really speaks to the impact that Corrine Brown has had in this community. Love her or hate her, she's made a lasting impact. And there are some different institutions and things that we have in this community, in part because of her ability to secure that funding. And Jenna, you talked about the confidence that the Congresswoman has had, and she's had that support system around her from day one.
She really has. Every day she's come here with really an entourage of supporters, both family and friends. These last few days, her daughter, Chantrell Brown, has been with her. You may remember that she was originally listed as a potential witness for the prosecution's side, and there was a big spat over whether or not she should be compelled to testify, essentially saying that she would plead the fifth if she was called to the stand, and ultimately the government decided not to call her as a witness, but she showed up every day for the last several days to be with her mother and was sitting in the first row behind Corrine Brown when that verdict was read.
And what was her demeanor like?
She is very much like her mother in terms of remaining stoic and trying to put on a brave face, I believe. She did not show great emotion in that moment, much like Corrine Brown did not. Really, there was only one person in the courtroom who was crying and was trying to keep it down, honestly, because the judge had asked for no emotional outbursts, nothing that would draw attention. But there were several people in the courtroom who were, rubbing each other's backs, holding hands. It was a packed room, and the emotion in there was very tense.
And Jenna was in the courtroom for every moment of the 8 days of testimony and this jury deliberation, which went on for 4 days. If you are just joining us, Tanika Hughes here with Action News Jax, joined with Action News Jax law and safety expert Dale Carson, offering his insight and perspective on what happened today. And Jenna Bourne, who was in the courtroom again from the start, former Congresswoman Corrine Brown found guilty on 18 of 22 counts in this federal fraud trial: conspiracy, scheme to conceal material facts, corrupt endeavor to obstruct and impede the due administration of Internal Revenue Law, and filing false tax returns. The only counts that she was found not guilty on were 2 counts each of aiding and abetting mail fraud and aiding and abetting wire fraud. Moments ago, we heard from her defense attorney, who says they plan to fight this. They plan to fight this case again.
File motions for a new trial.
They want to file motions for a new trial. She'll be sentenced in at least 90 days. We expect Ronnie Simmons and Carla Wiley, her co-conspirators, to be sentenced first. Right now, I want to toss it back to John and Letitia there in the studio. They're joined with Ken Jefferson to kind of talk to us about the criminal aspect of this case. And Ken's also a friend of Corrine Brown.
Tanika, you're right. And before we bring Ken in, who has known the congressman for a long time, a couple quick thoughts as we sit here and have had the opportunity to watch our coverage here for the last hour or so. First and foremost, I want to point out that, again, Corrine Brown was convicted of 18 of the 22 counts that she faced. But it's notable here, the 2 key players in this who pled guilty and then were part of the prosecution's key testimony against Corrine Brown, Ronnie Simmons, he faced 18 counts, similar counts, the same counts, 18 of the 22 counts that Corrine Brown faced. His guilty plea, 2 counts. 2 counts of conspiracy to commit mail fraud and mail and wire fraud and theft of government funds. So by pleading guilty, he got 2 counts instead of possibly a lot more. Carla Wiley, the director of One Door for Education, the charity that is the center of this whole case, she pled guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. So interesting to point out what they pled guilty to and what Corrine Brown has now been convicted of. Interesting to hear. Now, I also wanted to point out I've got to call it back up here before we bring in Ken, because Ken has a different perspective. But this is from Acting Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Blanco on the prosecution side here. Former Congresswoman Corrine Brown violated the public trust, the honor of her position, and the integrity of the American system of government when she abused one of the most powerful positions in the nation for her own personal gain. She shamefully deprived needy children of hundreds of thousands of dollars that could have helped with their education and improved their opportunities for advancement. And she lied to the IRS and the American public about secret cash deposits into her personal bank accounts. Again, from Kenneth Blanco, Acting Assistant Attorney General.
And Ken Jefferson, crime and safety expert, when you hear those words, you know there is a big portion of our community that is shaking their heads and really can't believe it.
Yeah. The whole community right now is shaking one way or the other, be it positive or negative. She held the seat for quite some time, many years. I think it was 24 years that she served as a congressperson, Congress representative to this particular area. And as I was saying earlier, she is known in the community not as Corrine Brown, but she's just known as Congresswoman. That's her name, that's her title, that's all of it. This verdict actually shook the community as it stands now, because people are appalled that this could happen, or that this would happen. The other 2 co-defendants pled out. They took a deal from the federal government, and you have to understand when the government comes with an indictment of some sort, they've got a case, for the most part, and they're going to pile it up. They're going to pile it up. You may not get convicted, as we saw, of every single charge that they have, but the meat of the charges that they want to convict you on, that's usually what they have the case on.
Ken, you spoke with Corrine Brown about a month ago before the trial started. What was that like?
I did. I ran into former Congresswoman Brown in passing, actually. She was upbeat. She was looking forward to her day in court. She basically said, I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight to the end. There was no plea deal thought that even came into her mind. She was going to fight it, and she did. And she went through our judicial system, our criminal justice system. And, you know, it's all we have. This is the criminal justice system. You're judged by a jury of your peers. They listen to the facts. They examine the evidence. They make a decision as to whether or not the state has made, or the federal government in this case, has made their case compelling to lead to a reasonable doubt, and then they make their decision. So 18 of the 22 charges where they found her guilty on, they made a decision that they felt compelled that the government made its case.
All right, Ken Jefferson, thank you very much, our crime and safety expert, weighing in both on the criminal aspect but also the personal aspect of this. And this really is a historic day for Jacksonville. Corrine Brown, an iconic public figure in this town for decades, has been found guilty of 18 of 22 counts. Action News Jax has continuing coverage online at actionnewsjax.com throughout the rest of the afternoon. And of course, we are going to have team coverage of all that has transpired this afternoon and really over the last 16 months or so coming up on Action News Jax at 5. We'll see you then.
This has been a breaking